Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to Talk with Sue. Tonight is going to be a very interesting night. Our special guest is former Premier Roger Grimes, and he's going to join us for a 2-hour conversation on politics and policies. And we certainly know there's been an awful lot going on over the past little while, so we're going to get to talk to the former Premier, and we've only had 11, so it gives us a very unique perspective when we talk to somebody who's held the top spot and sat in the office and dealt with a number of the issues that we have even facing us today. Of course, we have Muskrat Falls and Bill 29, the Liberal and Tory leadership races, new Premier and Tom Marshall, resignations of Kathy Dunderdale and Jerome Kennedy, crossing on the floor of several MHAs, natural resource development, recently the Auditor General's report, budgetary issues, debts and deficits, the state of health care, changes in the political polling results, and the state of the NDP and the ruling Tories. That's changing tide for the Liberals. And so we're going to find out, as we get settled in, what's in store for us in 2014. So I welcome to our program now former Premier Roger Grimes. Good evening.
Hi, Sue. How are you?
Not too bad. It's going to be an interesting night. I guess you got some of the list that I threw out there.
Yes, I was just making a few notes as we go.
Yeah, it's sitting in that chair and holding that position, and you know the responsibilities involved, and many of these issues, of course, are very serious issues, and you hear people, public out there talking an awful lot about what we're going to do about this and that. I mean, let's start right off the top. I know since I announced on Twitter and Facebook and so on, and social media, that we were having this program, one of the number one questions coming to you from our listening audience is Muskrat Falls. If you were Premier now, would you stop it?
Today, no doubt, in a position, for example, that Tom Marshall is in now as an interim Premier. He's still by law the full-fledged Premier of the province by every legal means that you can become the Premier. He has all the authority that any Premier has ever had in Newfoundland and Labrador for the next while. And by the way, Sue, it looks like he's going to be there a bit longer than most people would have thought, because usually, a leadership process might take 2 or 3 months. It looks like this one is going to run closer to 5 or 6 months for sure, because of the logistics of what the progressive conservatives in our province are trying to accomplish. So Tom Marshall is going to be the Premier, bona fide, for a considerable period of time. And in that period of time, relating directly to Muskrat Falls, one of the things that he could do, because he's already talked about they're going to review Bill 29. They seem to be trying to run away from that issue as quickly as they possibly can. One of the things he could do to make a real change in Newfoundland and Labrador is to say we are going to suspend continuing expenditures on the Muskrat Falls project until, and this is in the same light as reviewing Bill 29, until we give the people of Newfoundland and Labrador through NALCOR a full update on what the expenditures have been to date, whether or not we've been within our cost estimates, whether we've been over cost, under cost, those kinds of things, because there was a rather significant article in the Telegram just recently on the weekend that looked at those issues, and Mr. Gilbert Bennett, who's the front man at NALCOR for that, again is saying that they would not even release the monies that were spent on the tenders that were let to date, which people like myself and lots of people that follow this find really strange. You can understand some commercial sensitivity related to the bidding process and that kind of part of the process, but once the contract is actually awarded, they even refuse to tell us how much they spent and whether it was what they budgeted, more than what they budgeted, less than what they budgeted. So Mr. Marshall could make a huge difference today, and I certainly would if I was there, by saying we're going to use one of their phrases, we're going to press the pause reset button, because this is the most significant major expenditure that the province has ever faced in its history. And to use their language, I would set and push the reset button today and not spend another cent until I've gone through a disclosure of what we've done to date, and I would re-engage the Public Utilities Board. They're going to be involved now in a review of the fiasco that occurred with the rolling blackouts and the lack of generation capacity on the island just about a month ago. So why not now fully reset the button, hit that pause reset button, and have a look at it? I'd stop the project in its tracks today until I could convince the people of the province that we're headed down the right road.
Is it, and just speaking of expenditures, at least what we partway know, is it too late to stop it, or is there a way to stop it and try to cut a better deal, do something else with the project? Would you be looking at all of that if it were in your hands now?
Absolutely, Sue. From this point of view, to my knowledge, and you see, that's the problem with Bill 29, with the Muskrat Falls project, with a lot of what sort of dogged the current progressive conservative government and largely led to Premier Dunderdale departing the scene. I have to say, to my knowledge, because I can't get a lot of definitive information from Nalcor, which is a company that I'm one of the 500,000 people that owns it. I own the company. You own the company. My wife owns the company. My daughter owns the company. My granddaughter owns the company. But they won't tell me what they're spending the money on. And, in many ways, I find that problematic to the point of almost being offensive. To my knowledge, let me start again. To my knowledge, as far as I know, they have not yet accessed the $5 billion that they have now got authority to borrow and have a group of financiers ready to put up the money. To my knowledge, so far they've only spent the money that we as the taxpayers have already given them in the last 2 or 3 budgets through the budgeting process in Newfoundland and Labrador. Because in each of the last several budgets, the provincial Conservative government has given to Nalcor significant amounts of money, over $600 million in this year's budget alone, which is coming to an end in the 2013-2014 budget. And as far as I know, that's the money they've been spending so far in Labrador. So we haven't gone into the really big debt pool yet. We're spending money that's already been given to them, that the taxpayers have already given to the province, that we've brought into the provincial treasury through other sources, through taxation of natural resource projects that are ongoing and so on. And we haven't really gone over that fiscal cliff of borrowing. The other option is to, if you're going to continue on, it should be fully reviewed, fully re-examined, because one of the options that I have discussed with some people is, well, maybe if the powerhouse and dam itself in Labrador at Muskrat Falls is supposed to come in at about $2 or $2.5 billion, and we've already given Nalcor a significant amount of that, and they wouldn't have to borrow much anyway. Maybe there's enough of a business case to be made to go ahead and finish constructing the dam and the powerhouse in Labrador, and then leaving the energy in Labrador for industrial development use, and forgetting about the link, because the 2041 group, as I understand it, which is fairly well established and has been fairly critical of this project for some time, suggests that a decision on a link to the island, and if there's going to be another link out to Nova Scotia or elsewhere, should really be left until 2041, which is not that far off now when you come to think of it, when we get to access and renegotiate the whole of the over 5,000 megawatts of energy that's involved in the existing Upper Churchill contract. So there's a bunch of tie-ins that would lead you to believe that now is the right time to pause, now is the right time to reset, now is the right time to reconsider, now is the right time to open up to the people of Newfoundland and Labrador, now is the right time to re-engage, and then if, as Wade Locke and so on predicted some time ago, that the larger scheme of the tie-in to the island and is still the least cost alternative, which I've never ever believed it is, then by all means, I guess you'll proceed. But I'm one of those that has never been convinced of the merits of this particular case. And I'd like to see the information, and there's never a better time or a better opportunity than to reassess the whole issue right now.
It's really become, I don't know, but the concern actually is growing every day. I'm quite sure it is, particularly after the blackout and the rolling blackouts and what appears to be the state that our energy system is in here, which has nothing to do with the development of that project. That has to do with maintenance and being prepared for what we have on the ground now and our population and industry and so on. It seems right now, you hear a lot, or we hear a lot, from the government. I guess the innuendo is it's too late, can't stop it now, can't review it now. It's almost I don't know. They're almost trying to convince themselves. I mean, this is an $8 billion project, and it's going on the backs of the electrical consumers. And as you point out, we're all shareholders in this project. You've been in the position, as most of our premiers have, where there's negotiations or discussions or potential contracts as they relate to hydroelectric development in Labrador. What would you say is what are the most distinct differences between what you were looking at doing and what's happening with this Muskrat project?
One huge one that I get to, Sue, but let me just sidetrack and make the one comment about the blackouts and the power outages that we had a month ago. To my view, I think it smacks of a good degree of negligence and mismanagement, and I'll wait and see what the Public Utilities Board review, shakes out, what comes out of that, rather than the government's independent review, because that's just another way of the government taking a few people that they know and asking them to do a review and come up with an answer that they like. But if we're going to start re-engaging the Public Utilities Board, this is a fantastic, ideal first place to do it, which is to let them use their full powers under the law to examine exactly what could possibly happen to have us without energy altogether, with Holyrood not ready, with the plant in Stephenville not ready, the plant in Mount Pearl not ready, and then rolling blackouts, which, I looked at the Wikipedia definitions on it, said it's unheard of in a developed country like ours. You'd expect it in a developing third world nation where their systems are not up to date and so on, and they're just getting into those areas, but it's unheard of. And the words that I used were the words that were there, that in a society like ours, a developed country like ours, a developed system like ours, rolling blackouts smack of negligence and mismanagement. But in terms of back to Labrador development of that Churchill River, the rest of the river, and Muskrat Falls and what we were attempting to do 10 years ago, the biggest difference and the most striking difference, Sue, would be this one. A decade ago, when we were working at that project, and everyone, by the way, that had worked at it before then, and even up to a year or so before 2010, even in the first several years of Danny Williams' tenure, everybody was working at the development of the Lower Churchill, the other projects, Gull Island and Muskrat Falls at some point in time, on the basis of export energy to an outside market. There was never a consideration that energy would on a cost-effective basis, be brought to the island to meet our needs on the island, unless and until you were having a massive amount of energy, which would be Gull Island, which is almost 4 times or 3 times for sure as big as Muskrat Falls, or in 2041 when you accessed the Upper Churchill to 5,000 megawatts instead of 800, that you might be able to build a financial case for paying for a line to come to the island without, offloading a large cost factor onto the ratepayers on the island. Because what's happening now, I saw a letter to the editor in the Telegram today, I believe, where someone compared the Muskrat Falls project to someone in a house where you're in the basement apartment, which is 40% of the house, but you pay for the basement apartment, but you pay for the whole house. Even though you're not going to get to own it for 35 or 40 or 50 years, but you're not allowed to pay rent on just the apartment. You have to pay for the entire house. And that's the way the Muskrat Falls deal is structured, which makes it so bad, in my view, is that the ratepayers on the island, those that pay a light bill, and I think it's just about everybody. They mightn't have electric heat, but they do have lights on, they do run a television, they do want a washer and a dryer and probably an electric range, a stove and so on in their house. So they have a light bill. Well, those people, all of us that do that and use electricity, we are going to pay for 100% of the energy on our light bills, even if we replace Holyrood, we're only going to ever use 40% of it. So that, to me, shows the desperation of the deal in the first place, that you foist it on us, that you make us pay for 100% of the house, even though we're ever only going to use 40% of it. But back to the difference again, that's why it was never contemplated 10 years ago, 7 years ago, 6 years ago, I would suggest even 5 years ago. It was never contemplated because nobody would think about that. Nobody would allow themselves to think about charging the ratepayers on the island for 100% of the energy when they were only going to use 40% of it. And that's why, by the way, the Public Utilities Board was kicked out of the review of the project. That's why the Public Utilities Board, by law, is not allowed to have anything to do with the rate setting associated with this project. That's going to be done by the Cabinet, because the Public Utilities Board, by law, would only be able to verify and allow charging the ratepayers for the energy that they actually use. We're actually going to get charged for energy that we're going to sell to Nova Scotia. We're going to get charged for energy that we're going to give to Nova Scotia because we're giving them 20% of it. We might sell them some more under the new contract that none of us are allowed to see, but we're definitely going to sell them some because otherwise they weren't going to approve the contract unless they got more energy. So we have to give them 20%. We have to sell them another 20 or 30% for way less than it's going to cost us to make it. But we in Newfoundland and Labrador have to pay for it. We have to pay for all of it as if we're using it ourselves. And that's why forever in history, up to 5 years ago, it was seen that on an economic basis, with the product being electricity, electrical energy, power, and the people paying for it being the end users, that if the end users were not going to pay for more than they use, then you would never do it for domestic on-island reasons because it was too expensive. So every project before was always an export project in which the energy that you exported, so whatever you sent to Quebec or to Nova Scotia or wherever you sent it, that the people there who bought it would pay enough for the power to pay for the cost of the project, and the ratepayers and the taxpayers in Newfoundland and Labrador, it would cost them nothing to have the project developed, versus now it's going to cost us several billions of dollars, and it's going to cost us severely increased light bills to have this project developed. So export versus domestic on-island use, that was the big difference in what we were dealing with before versus what we're dealing with now. And I even track it back, if I could continue for a second. People always talk about what a disaster the Upper Churchill was compared to, and Joey Smallwood and the giveaways and so on. Well, the Upper Churchill, so a couple of things to remember. The Upper Churchill project didn't cost the taxpayers or the ratepayers of Newfoundland and Labrador 1 cent, not a copper. The energy that was produced paid for the total borrowing, paid the total bill, and as a matter of fact, every year since it's been built, Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro, which is part of Nalcor now, always made a profit in this province, sometimes approximating 70, 80, 90, $100 million a year. Now, the bad sore point was that Quebec resold it and made $500 or $600 million a year, 5 and 6 and 7 times as much as we did. But we didn't have to pay a cent. We made a profit. They made a profit way bigger than ours. That was the unfairness of it. But in fact, this time around, we are going to pay for every cent of it on our light bills and through our taxes by paying back the cost of the borrowing that we're going to do as the provincial government on behalf of Nalcor. So it's hard to believe that people would look at it and say, well, this is a fabulous thing, this is a great deal. I still haven't seen a business case that makes a lot of sense to me, because export was always the use for Labrador Power, with an amount to be reserved for Labrador use whenever you need it, which is still there and available today.
Yeah, the industrial part of it, and obviously that's the hydropower advantage, is industrial development. If you're not dragging it across waterways and you're putting it across land, obviously there's some industrial attraction, or there could be some industrial attraction there, which is not something they've seemed to have focused on. In fact, I think at this point they're not focusing on it at all when it's right there to be focused on. And, it's interesting when you talk about, well, first of all, on the Upper Churchill, which is one of the most fascinating details to me, it was done on time and on budget. That's going to be an interesting feat to match. So that should be thrown in there as well on that project. It was one of the best engineered projects this world has ever seen, and it was done on time and on budget. But, we look at it now and we talk about, I want to just take you back, if I could, just a little ways, and talk about, I'm not talking about the Voisey's Bay deal. I'm going to try to mix it, I guess, with this whole energy situation. And when you were doing the Voisey's Bay deal, which arguably is the best deal that we've ever made industrially in our province, in that we got all the construction work, and obviously we're getting the after work, which means we'll have 30, 40, 50 years of long-term trade employment. I remember that when the current government, which was then the opposition, was all over having long-term permanent jobs out of any resource that we develop. Now, we look at this project, Muskrat Falls, and one of the key areas and problems are, where's the long-term employment? We're spending $8 billion, and we're not getting thousands of jobs in the long term. We're not getting industrially associated jobs. We're getting a construction contract. And so, at this point, and looking at industry out there and how hydropower is offered throughout the world, our neighbors included in Quebec, but whether it's in Iceland, by the way, that certainly doesn't ship its over any waterways, it's there on land, how it's used to attract industrial customers. But the Tories, who were the opposition at the time, that was their big kicking point on every single thing. How do you think, or how would you rate their performance as it relates to creating long-term permanent jobs out of natural resources?
Well, it's clear at this point that it hasn't happened. Just briefly with the Voisey's Bay deal, I'll just make two comments. One is this: the provincial government, again, and the taxpayers in Newfoundland and Labrador, did not have to put up one single cent. And between Inco and Diamond Fuel Resources, Inco, Vale, Inco now, and all these groups, they have spent billions of dollars in the province in the last decade. They've employed thousands of people. They've spent several billions of dollars on the long-term plant in Long Harbour alone, which is supposed to go into production, I believe, this year, within the range of 450 to 550 full-time jobs, which are expected to last about 70 or 75 years is the current estimate, because of the fact that that's the life expectancy for the mine in Labrador, which is about now to go underground. So all those kinds of things are there. There's nothing that shows those kinds of prospects with respect to Muskrat Falls. And by the way, there have been no other developments initiated by the Conservative government. They're currently constructing modules and the topsides and so on for the Hebron Bed and Nevis project, which is to come on stream, I think, in 2017. But again, one of the things that they had to do right away was they had to take a cash payout, because they agreed with the assessment of the company that a module that everybody said in the original documents was to be built in Newfoundland and Labrador to at least give us the short-term construction jobs. Even that didn't happen. We took, I think, $150 million in cash instead, and the module's being built in Korea somewhere. So not only have they not moved ahead, they've actually moved back a little bit. And the thought of tying it to Muskrat Falls, one of the things I mentioned earlier, Sue, was maybe it's worthwhile, to spend $2.5 billion, most of which we've given Nalcor already, so they wouldn't have to borrow any money, to deal with finishing the dam and the powerhouse in Labrador for industrial development in Labrador, because at a point, again, just over a decade ago, we had been approached by the major aluminum smelters in the world, Alcoa and Alcan, saying that they would be very interested in getting in on the development of the energy at the Lower Churchill if the province were to give them sole access to the additional new power to fuel their smelters, which would, could go on for 40, 50, 60, 70 years. And of course, what you go through is you do a cost-benefit analysis to see whether or not that makes sense. At the time, it seemed like it might. Some of the political optics negative to it are this: that is, they wanted to actually own the plant for the first 30 or 40 years, but in the meantime, they were going to use all the power. Wasn't going to cost us anything. They were going to build a couple of smelters in Labrador. They were going to employ hundreds of people. They were going to bring in product from around the world to smelt in Labrador. So on a cost-benefit basis, it seemed to make sense, because between the monies raised, the income tax paid, the business tax paid, and so on, the fact that and then at the end of the piece, much like now with the link to Nova Scotia, 35 years in, we're going to get a link to Nova Scotia, which is at the end of its life. Well, with the Alcoa, Alcan people, 35 or 40 years in, they'd give us back the plant.
In the developed world, Roger, you can look around at a lot of countries, northern countries, that have that are endowed with hydropower, and invariably all of them have utilized that hydropower to attract industry and develop that hydropower with industry. And of course, our neighbors, Quebec, have done a very, very good job of that, because when they talk about hydropower, they talk about having 40,000 jobs linked to the development of their power, because they keep talking about their smelters, be they aluminum or smelting for other minerals. It's kind of a ratio that they do. For every megawatt of power, there's so many long-term permanent jobs created. And all that seems to have been lost. And on the point you made with respect to the Nova Scotian power, we're consumers here. If we just take it from a consumer point of view, we pay for the actual generation of the power. We pay for the transmission of the power, all the transmission network. We pay then for the distribution of the power, most of us through Newfoundland Power. So we pay for all of that, and all that combined gives us what we have to pay for power. Now, Nova Scotia built a line over to themselves, and that's what they've had to pay for the power. So they're not paying for the generation. They're not paying for the transmission as such. I mean, they're paying for their part going over. And we, in fact, as ordinary consumers in Newfoundland and Labrador, are paying for power even in a much different way than they're getting their power, their 20% for. They're not having to include all those costs. What they're including is the cost to deliver it over to them, when normally that would be part of a cost along with generation, the generation, which of course is all the dams and everything we have to do to produce the power to begin with. Something really seems off with this project.
No doubt, and Sue, you raise a good point, because from the very beginning, when this was announced, the Conservative government here, at that time, remember that Kathy Dunderdale was the Natural Resources Minister and Danny Williams was the Premier, and he was gone within weeks, and she then became the Premier. So she's been the Premier for all of this except the announcement. Yes. She's been the Premier through the whole piece for now. Many people raised, myself being one of them, that how did it make any sense that we were going to give Nova Scotia 20% of the energy free for 35 years? And they always bristled at that comment. They didn't like it. They tried to suggest that it wasn't free, that they were putting in $1.5 billion and they were paying, but they weren't. As you just pointed out, they were not paying for the energy. They were paying for a line which they got to own for 35 years, so they could transport their own free energy that they paid absolutely nothing for over for their own use. So, they never ever like to hear described that way, but that happens to be the truth. They are not contributing one single cent towards the cost of the generation of the electricity at Muskrat Falls. Not one copper. They're paying for a line which they own, and as I said just a few minutes ago, by the time they turn it over to us in 35 years, every study that's out there today says that these underwater cables, they have a 35 to 40-year life expectancy. So they're going to pass it back to us when it's due to be completely refurbished or redone or rebuilt. And they would have owned it for the whole
because
time.
Everybody, as I said, I thought it was generally understood that when the components of what you're paying for in power, in the case of the consumer, you pay for the generation, transmission, and then distribution. And clearly, the power to them is free, and the cost that they have is just delivering it to itself. But if we were in a normal deal, putting the generation on and then the transmission lines across, we would be billing them for the cost of generation and transmission. We would be owning those lines, and we would be billing them for, the full kit and caboodle. Somehow, this has gotten really skewed. And then to make matters worse, in order to get it through their UARB up there, their equivalent, I guess, of pub, we've now gone ahead and they have 40 to 50% of the power?
Oh, no question. And again, notice that you said they want to have, 40 to 50%, because they won't tell us. You see, here's the biggest sticking point in this to me, and when I've talked about it in public before, I said, listen, the best that anybody can do, the biggest favor anybody can do for us in Newfoundland and Labrador, the biggest favor that Tom Marshall could do today is to say, Nalcor is no longer exempt from freedom of information, even though Bill 29 makes the access to it pretty tough in many cases anyway. But they're completely exempt. They don't have to talk to anybody. My understanding, by the way, my personal understanding, is that was the major reason why Jerome Kennedy left the cabinet when he was the finance minister, because he had been natural resources minister. He was the finance minister. He knew we were sending over hundreds of millions of dollars to Nalcor, but even he, as the finance minister, was then not allowed to ask them how they spent it. The phrase was he wanted to have an oversight committee in the government. So at least in the government they could know what Nalcor was doing. And my understanding from all of my contacts is that was the major disagreement between Premier Dunderdale at the time and Finance Minister Kennedy at the time. Now, and notice the irony in that. Neither one of them engaged in politics in the province today, no longer involved. But my understanding is their biggest disagreement was that at least Jerome Kennedy, when he was taking his role as the finance minister very seriously, was saying to the premier that we as the elected government must have some major oversight role into what Nalcor is doing with that money over there that we just passed them over, so that if the people of the province ask us, at least we'll know what they did and we can decide to tell them, because Nalcor is exempt from everything and will probably never tell us. And even today, the article I referenced, Gilbert Bennett was in the paper saying, well, I'm not going to give you any details of the contracts to date. But sure, why not? Because right now, Sue, is the perfect time to find out whether or not we've been coming in on budget, whether we've been over budget, have we been lucky enough to be under budget, and those kinds of things. Because, the startling ones, again, strange the things you hear. But, I was told by good, reliable sources that on the easiest piece of work done with respect to Muskrat Falls, the most routine piece of work done last spring and summer was to put the access road in. You're just building a road. You're cutting down a few trees, doing a bit of trenching on the side, and you're building a road. And apparently, I'm told it was budgeted for $17 million and came in at 32, which is almost a 100% overrun. Now, is that true? Gilbert Bennett will not tell me. Gilbert Bennett will not tell you. Gilbert Bennett, from what I just told you, would not tell Jerome Kennedy when he was the finance minister. And apparently the premier at the time, Mrs. Dunderdale, agreed that she didn't want to know. Nalcor was doing this. Let them do what they like. We're going to pass them over the money. We're going to do the project, and that's it. End of discussion. So, that's the problem that we have, is that we need to know what's going on. And if it's, if it's such a good deal, why didn't we do it the other way? Why didn't we also build the link to Nova Scotia rather than let Emera? We could have borrowed the other, the other $150 million or the other $1.5 billion, I'm sure, if we were going to build the link and own it ourselves and charge them and get our money back. But instead, Emera gets to make the money on it. But they can only make money because they're not paying anything, not 1 cent towards the generation cost. Because if they had to contribute 20% of the generation cost, then it would not be a good business deal for them. They would not have done it. So the only way they got involved is because they were given 20% of the energy free of charge. And I know some people don't like to hear that, but it was absolutely free of charge. And that's just not good enough.
Do you feel confident, and you make, obviously that's a very important point, a very significant point. Let's just take that point and say, okay, let's just say we went to an aluminum company or some other industry that could be placed in Labrador, and we said to them, we'll give you the energy free for 35 years. Don't you think that the upside to Newfoundland and Labrador would be that we end up with the industrial jobs? And how is that any different? And why are we going a route where we're giving them that when, in fact, we could turn around and give it to an industrial user?
I think it was possible a decade ago. It's possible today, and I believe with every bone in my body that a cost-benefit analysis would show that it would be worth our while to spend $2.5 or $3 billion in Labrador to produce the energy, to give it to, say, an Alcoa or an Alcan, have them build 2 or 3 several billion-dollar smelters, employ hundreds of people who would contribute business taxes and income taxes to the province, raise their families in the communities, all those kinds of spin-off. I believe the cost-benefit shows that it could happen. This current government obviously didn't even want to look at that because remember the changing view of why we were doing Muskrat Falls in the first place. That wasn't a thing. Remember, the announcement was 2 things. We needed it on the island anyway.
Right.
We needed it. We were going to shut down Holyrood, so we had to bring in this energy. Now, again, if you shut down Holyrood, you take out 300, 350 or so megawatts. You don't take out 800. You don't need to build 824 to replace 300. So there's a whole bunch left over anyway, which again they could have given to somebody. And the other thing was every now and then you say, oh yeah, but we're going to do some. But back in the day, in the initial announcement, they didn't talk about industrial development in Labrador at all. The second reason was we were going to go out through Nova Scotia, and buddy, we were going to right the wrongs of the past, and we were going to bypass Quebec and be major players in the North American energy system without having to go through Quebec. That was the 2 reasons given on the day of the announcement in the speeches at the hotel here in St. John's. And it turns out
and
now
I remember too,
that neither one of them
that
are,
we got to the point where greening up Canada was one of the major reasons why we're doing is participating in green energy, so they call it in Canada, when Newfoundland and Labrador per capita has been greening up Canada more than anybody else has, with the 5,000 megawatts coming from the Upper Churchill. And all of a sudden now, we needed, in our province of Newfoundland and Labrador, with 500,000 people, to spend $6-7 billion greening up Canada. And that was a reason given.
Sure enough. To add to your point, by the way, even in terms of our own usage, where we have a few industrial players that are not necessarily green in terms of emissions, say, if you take Come by Chance as an example. But even with that, we were still the least polluting province in the country anyway.
We greened up the country by 5,000 megawatts, which is unheard of. Per capita, we are the greatest in doing that. We've never been given, obviously, the credit for it. That's just a continuation of some of the Upper Churchill problems. But it's when you look at it and say, what are we really getting out of this? And then to make matters worse, the line that's coming from Labrador onto the Avalon is also going to be partially owned by Emera, and Emera now is going to be making money off the consumers of Newfoundland and Labrador on the line. So they are now taking part of the transmission and making money not from the Nova Scotia power, but from the power we would purchase in Newfoundland and Labrador. What possibly could be the reason of adding into it another player that gets to add on more money that they need to make coming out of our pockets? We've always dealt with Hydro and Newfoundland Power. Now we've got a third player in Emera. What possibly could be the reason, logically, for having Emera have any ownership of it?
No, I understand it, and that puzzled me no end from the very first time I looked at the project as well. As much as I couldn't grasp the business case for it overall about this bypassing Quebec and all the other reasons given. Once you even look at it, even if you buy that, even if you say, okay, well, I'll buy into it. I've got misgivings, but okay, that's probably all right. We won't go through Quebec. We'll go through Nova Scotia and so on. Once you buy into that, then you can fully understand the role of Emera as a partner. Even though if it's that good a project, why wouldn't we borrow that extra $1.5 billion and do it all ourselves anyway?
Exactly.
And it's not that good a project because you got no one out there to buy it for what it's going to cost you to make it. That's why you couldn't do it. So you had to load it all onto ourselves. But then, the other piece of it, Sue, as you pointed out, why would we need another player in the private sector delivering energy on the island? That part is unforgivable, really, to have Emera come in here and dip into the pot and be part of, when they charge us, like Newfoundland Light and Power is now as a distributor in most communities in Newfoundland, when they're here actually tying in our houses and getting the juice into our house and making their cut of the money. Why are we now having Emera coming in, sharing in that kind of money? Because before, basically, in general broad terms, Hydro did the heavy lifting in terms of getting Newfoundland Labrador Hydro did the heavy lifting in terms of getting the energy from, say, Bay d'Espoir and Catarm and so on to the centres where it was going to be used, and then Newfoundland Power sort of distributed it largely around to the households and the businesses in the area. But now we've got, in that Hydro part, you've got Emera is a partner in the heavy lifting of lugging the energy.
Yeah, it's almost like
to the Avalon Peninsula.
Yeah.
No need for them to be involved at all, none whatsoever, and it just brings in another person. All it did, in my view, was fatten up the pot for Emera to give them guaranteed cash flow, which is why their president was ecstatic the day this was announced, because their stock soared, because they were going to make a fortune. They were in a no loss position, absolutely no risk, no possible loss, upside, and then as if they weren't going to make enough, just taking their own free power to Nova Scotia and selling it at a profit. Now they're going to get their fingers into the pie on the island.
Yeah, it's a social treason, I call it. I mean, there's absolutely no logical sense for them being a player in that at all. That's just, as you point out, is just another avenue for them to make some cash, while we, the ratepayers in Newfoundland, on the island portion anyway, will be paying the lock, stock, and barrel of what's going on in this whole development. And I think it's important that, again, we go back, because most of us were around and in 2002, and we heard the rhetoric. It was mostly focused on Voisey's Bay, but certainly on the proposed development of part of the Lower Churchill, a deal that you were looking at. And all of it came down to permanent, long-term jobs, ownership by the people, and most importantly, because I'm sure we all remember this, was the absolute, and Danny Williams was very aggressive on this, making sure that all of the information was out and all of it was available, and everybody got to have a look at it, and then everybody got to debate it. I mean, that was the mantra of this man and his opposition party at the time for 8 to 9 months. We listened to this. And now we're talking about something that is probably the most secretive thing we've ever done. What do you have to say to that? 10 years later?
I think the answer lies in where Mr. Williams was after he became premier, and what you say is absolutely true, and we've gone completely 180 degrees from that position. But a smaller one on a smaller scale, but it showed what happened was this, and I'll tie it into what's happening today. Danny Williams, well-known, well-respected, successful business person in his own right and so on, going to come in with no government experience and those kinds of things, take over the government, do it his way, going to open everything up. Everything has to be open. And by the way, we did. Even today, you can go online, and in Hansard, which is the record of the debates in the House of Assembly, you can find out every word that was spoken by every member about the Voisey's Bay project. Every single detail of the contract is available online. No commercial sensitivity, no blacking out, no nothing. It's all there for everybody in the province to see, because we own it, by the way. We gave someone the right to develop Voisey's Bay, but we own it. So people should know on what basis they own it. And that was all done. Go fast forward. Danny Williams becomes the premier. One of the things in the election in 2003 was the potential closure of the paper mill in Stephenville. And his definitive statement was, Stephenville will never close on my watch. Stephenville has been closed for over 10 years. And when he was asked, what happened? He said, well, I guess I was naive, was the word he used. I guess I was naive. Because once he became the premier, he realized it wasn't in his best interest to be giving all this information out in the public, so much so that I believe that he was a large part of the architect of the Bill 29 changes, so they didn't get enacted during his time. But he certainly even said, and it was reported in the papers a few days ago, that when the information commissioner was asking for information, he said, well, we're not giving it. He'll go to court. If the court rules that we have to give the information, we'll change the law. We're not giving this information. So, a complete 180-degree turn. And here's the tie-into today, Sue. We have a potential leadership candidate already announced for the Conservatives in terms of Mr. Barry. Similar type of background, has success by certain measures in his own industry, his own area. Fairly well known to certain groups of people. Going to come into government, he says, with a stick in each hand, clean it up, going to tell the world, do away with Bill 29. Everybody needs to know. And I would suggest that all laudable, but I think he's a bit naive. There's always a little bit, there's some things in terms of cabinet discussions where you have to have a discussion that have to be private. But by and large, I agree with telling everybody everything, especially once the deal is done. Like we did with Voice, we spelled out the contract itself is in the public domain, every word of it. The Conservatives under Danny Williams and Kathy Dunderdale made 2 or 3 amendments to it, largely in terms of just giving them more time to get the work finished and make a couple of concessions. And I went in online to try to find out what the changes were. And just like anybody else looking, by the way, under their new freedom of information, under Bill 29, most of it is a piece of paper with a whole lot of black through it because it's blacked out. You can't see what changes they made because they won't tell you. But they insisted, and we did the debate, that we know everything about it, but we're not allowed to know anything about the changes they made. They'll tell us in a press conference that we did something that's good. Trust us. And, that didn't work, didn't certainly work for Kathy Dunderdale, and it didn't work for the government today, and it's not going to work into the future, which is why Tom Marshall is already promising review, and I think the other parties are saying, we're going to make away with the secrecy of Bill 29 anyway, and we're going to let the people of Newfoundland and Labrador, we're going to treat them as mature, educated, intelligent adults. We're going to tell them what's happening. We're going to tell them the pros and the cons. We're going to tell them why we went a certain way based on that, and they can judge for themselves as mature, sensible, intelligent, educated adults whether or not they think we made a good decision instead of saying, trust us, we're not telling you, but it's for your better good.
I had one question on the, and I'm going to put it out now. How do you feel we proceed with Muskrat Falls until the water management agreement is found to be legal? That management order goes out till 2015. Do you think there's any inherent risks there?
Oh, most definitely, and that's why, back to the beginning again. I think if Tom Marshall wanted to put a real stamp on this as being new, different, caring for the people of Newfoundland and Labrador, caring about the financial, fiscal future of the province, which he always professes to have done as a finance minister and a minister in other capacities, now is the time to push the pause button. Like, stop. Don't go further until you have some certainty. With respect to the water management issue, there have been groups that have suggested that rather than have that going through the courts in Quebec, why didn't we refer it to our own court ourselves before we did the sanction, before we went further ahead? But again, on balance, unless there's something that I don't know, Sue, I still don't think we're gone too far down the road, because that we can't stop and pause, and if it's good, we pick it up and keep on going. If it's not, remember this. The other thing that these business people that say they want to come in and run the government, do a good job and so on, run it as a business, Mr. Barry's phrase is, the government of Newfoundland is like Newfoundland Inc. You got to run it as a business. Danny Williams said run it as a business, those kinds of things. So you run it as a business, but one of the adages in business too that a lot of people have been successful at and benefited from is that you review what you're doing and you don't send good money after bad. So if you push the pause button, and even though you might have $1 billion or $1.5 billion spent, well, you haven't borrowed another $5 yet. You haven't gone further down the road. You'll know whether or not the cost overruns are likely to occur. You'll know whether it's going to be a $7, $8, $9, or $10 billion project. You'll know what that's going to cause to happen to the ratepayers and their light bills, their electricity bills here on the island, because it's not really directly related to light bills in Labrador. That's different and separate because we're not linked yet. So you get all those kinds of things. Now is the perfect time to pause, stop, review, reflect before you go further. And one of the key issues, of course, that's been said over and over again, that if the water management agreement is not found to be the way Nalcor interprets it, but the way that Hydro-Quebec interprets it, then we cannot generate the 800 megawatts that we say we're going to produce anyway. So why would you go further in the project without having that clarity? And that's another issue that's been very troubling and puzzling to me.
And just taking this a bit further now, since the last provincial election, the significant change was made regarding how much power Nova Scotia is going to be entitled to, or Mayor is going to be entitled to, and it's a significant change from what was put forth prior to the last election. Would you think that, and let's say we take the time to review and put all the information out there for all the people to see, wouldn't it be fair to say, put the pause button on, reset, let all the information out, and let the people decide in 2015?
Oh, sure enough, and you'd lose nothing. You'd lose nothing. And the one other thing that we gained, to tie it into another recent experience, which is the lack of energy that we had through the Christmas, New Year's periods and the rolling blackouts, you'd force Nalcor and Newfoundland Hydro, as a subsidiary of Nalcor, to refocus itself on the security of electrical generation on this island. Because, we're stuck, by the way, with what we've got until at least 2017, which is the rest of this winter and another couple of winters, and maybe into 2018. So there's nothing going to change with respect to the kinds of things that we just experienced a month ago on this island, unless and until Nalcor and Newfoundland Labrador Hydro, as a subsidiary of Nalcor, rededicates itself to making sure that we have security of generated capacity and supply on this island. And that ties into the kinds of things where we get completely conflicting and different answers as to what about the third line coming from central Newfoundland through Soldiers Pond, to service the Avalon. At one point, Cathy Dunderdale, as the Natural Resources Minister, first when the mill in Grand Falls was expropriated a few years ago, and the fiasco that was, that cost $300 million here, $150 million to the government of Canada, those kinds of big, huge missteps made along the way. In principle, maybe not a bad thing to do, but wasn't done right. So you get that, and at the time, we had a blackout here for a few days. The question was put to Mrs. Dunderdale at the time as the Natural Resources Minister, saying, well, how come we couldn't use that energy that you just took from Grand Falls? Because we expropriated the energy resources. Her answer was, we couldn't get it here to St. John's because we don't have capacity on the line. We need another line to get that here. Well, when we had the blackouts a month ago, Ed Martin and Mrs. Dunderdale were up saying it wouldn't matter if you had the line or not. It wouldn't matter if you had the line or not. Now, they were partially true, because the fact of the matter was the problem was that Holyrood, which produces most of the power here, was down and not functioning properly. And there wasn't enough to bring in from out there to stop all of what was going to happen. But what we have in this province on the island, Sue, is we have an excess of generated capacity outside the overpass to serve the rest of the needs of the island, and we have an undercapacity on the Avalon itself. So that third line, by the way, which they said a month ago you don't need, they're going to build it as part of the Upper Churchill project, but they didn't cost it as part of it. They didn't roll that into the cost of it.
Yeah,
Sorry,
all this is very, very strange, Roger, because, let's look at this. When we're talking about planning for load, energy requirements, and so on, this Tory government has been talking about all the move or relocation, obviously, onto the Avalon. We can see what the trends are. We can see what's going on. Rural Newfoundland, the island portion for sure, has taken a very heavy bashing as it relates to industry closures and people having to move. So there has been a trend ongoing, and not to have enough power, even though we have enough power, but from the standpoint of the load and the distribution, not to be able to see it or predict it and have the mess that we had here just a month ago. How can we call it anything but negligence? People do these things 10 years out. They know these things 10 years out. How is it we got this so wrong? I said to someone not too long ago, I don't recognize Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro anymore.
No, and you wouldn't. Just an aside, when the rolling blackouts and so on were going on, remember that one of the things was the Premier was absent for the first couple of days or so, and the first person that spoke to it was Mr. Henderson, who's the Vice President of Hydro. Now, he is, in my view, he is the electricity authority over in Nalcor. He's the person, that's his background, that's his experience. He's the head guy really at Hydro. In the Hydro that you would have recognized before the creation of Nalcor, he'd be like the top man. He's a systems man. He knows the systems, and he was out telling people on the media that they saw this coming because they knew that Holyrood wasn't up, that Stephenville and Mount Pearl weren't ready. There was cold weather forecasted. He said they saw it coming. By the time Mrs. Dunderdale and Mr. Martin went out a day later, they had changed the story. They said, no, it was just an unfortunate set of circumstances. We couldn't predict it. We could predict it, Sue. The man that told the truth was Mr. Henderson. And he's the one that you can count on with respect to that. What we have here on the Avalon, there's a statistic that always sticks in my mind. When you're sitting in the Confederation building here in St. John's, you're always told by all of the people that handle the stats that within an hour's drive of the Confederation building, so when you get out around Bay Roberts, the other side of Conception Bay, certainly by the time, even before you get to Clarenville, right? So you take the southern shore, you take the region out here, before you even get to Clarenville, you have already met over 50% of the people that live in this entire province. So, you're talking about the move to the Avalon. Absolutely. It's been going on for years. It's here. It's real. And Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro knows and knew and still knows that the need for the energy is right here on the Avalon, right in and around the capital city region, northeast Avalon, even more specifically. This is the kind of thing I think that the PUB, the Public Utilities Board review will get at. And remember now, in 2010, just before the Premier today, Mr. Williams, announced we were going to do Muskrat Falls, the Hydro had applied for that third line from central Newfoundland. They had an application before the Public Utilities Board saying we need that line to bring some extra energy in from outside the Avalon into the Avalon to meet this growth on the Avalon. And then after Muskrat Falls was announced, they withdrew their application because they were asked a whole series of questions about the load, about why would you build such a line, and the answers didn't match up with the rationale for Muskrat Falls. So rather than answer the questions, and I think the PUB asked them over 30 questions, rather than provide the answers to the PUB under the direction of Nalcor, Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro withdrew the application. And I believe that's exactly what's happening over there, is that Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro and people like Mr. Henderson, they really do, in their hearts and souls, know what needs to be done for security of generation and transmission and, good supply on the island. But I think they're being overridden and actually just sort of pushed aside by Mr. Martin and the group at Nalcor, saying, no, that doesn't meet our overall goals. It might be what you need for electricity, but our plan is to do something different. So never mind what we absolutely need, as you say, to do for the next 3 or 4 years. We've got our eyes on a bigger goal. We want to talk about being exporters in the market. We want to talk about having our own marketing arm at Nalcor for selling energy into New York. They're not selling any energy into New York. The only bit they sell is the bit they sell through Emera when they took the contract from Hydro-Quebec for the recall power, gave it to Emera, and Emera sold it for less in the marketplace for us in Newfoundland and Labrador than Hydro-Quebec was doing. We went from $50 million a year down to $30 million a year just so we could say that someone was doing it other than Quebec. A big price to pay. You talk about taking, your nose in spite of your face and so on. That's the kind of thing that we did. And, those things don't make any sense.
Now we're going to talk to Hydro-Quebec again. So after all that, now that's not going to prevent them from talking to Hydro-Quebec to begin with. So I think that was just simply, that's just irrational. I can't even get my head around that. We'll move off from Muskrat Falls because there's obviously so many other issues, but Muskrat, along with Bill 29, obviously, are causing a lot of duress for the people in the province. It's significant. The polls have, decreased substantially for the Tories. They're in a bit of a mess politically. What do you make of the current situation the PCs find themselves in? It was quite the tumble, and also the resignation of Premier Dunderdale.
My view of it is this. I think I made this kind of comment on a television panel several months ago, back early last fall. The whole notion was this, that I believe the root, all of the difficulties for the current Conservative administration and finally leading up to the premature departure and ouster of Premier Dunderdale, because she was removed by her own caucus. There's no other story, no other possible way it could have happened. She was removed by her own caucus. She's the only sitting premier of a majority government who's ever left, and you only leave if your own crowd kicks you out one way or the other. So that's, the nuts and bolts of what happened. But it all traces back to when Felix Collins, as the Justice Minister, introduced the amendments to Bill 29. From that day on, the government was never, ever, ever seen to be the same, because it tied into Muskrat Falls, because, again, they said, well, whatever we do here, you're not allowed to ask about Muskrat Falls. We're not even going to ask. The story I told you about Jerome Kennedy and the oversight and the Premier today, we're not even going to ask as the government, so we don't expect ordinary Newfoundlanders to ask. You just got to trust us, trust Nalcor and so on, And then it goes to the budget, which was obviously so poorly thought out. I mean, they were going to decimate the Department of Justice. They hadn't talked to anybody, and they found out a few days later they couldn't do it. The court system was going to come to a grinding halt, so they had to reverse their decisions. They did the adult basic education program, which is still being offered and might survive in its own way. But again, they did it without any consultation with anybody. They just made a decision, whacked the number out of the budget, couldn't defend it, and so on. So then the whole tie into Bill 29 was they're saying, well, we're not going to give you any rationale. You can't get any information. But when you come to understand what we did, when you get to know why we did it, you will like it. That was the phrase, I think, that was really the nail in the coffin. I'm not going to tell you, but at some point in the future, you will understand why I did this, and then you will agree with us. Premier Dunderdale herself used that line on countless occasions, and I believe the people of the province found that to be demeaning, insulting. It meant that we were sort of stupid. You couldn't give us information. My thought on it, so you see, was always this, that if you and I are going to have a chat, and if I give you the information that I have, and we're both, half intelligent, sensible, practical people, then 9 times out of 10, I believe we'll probably come to the same conclusion. If we have all the same facts in front of us, and all the same options, and we both know all the same information, we'll probably pick the same choice. Unless you got some really very different political philosophies at work, that shag people. We're not going to take care of people. We're just going to take care of the bottom line, and if people get hurt, people get hurt. Well, if you got that philosophy, I guess you could choose something different than I did. But if you're trying to always strike the balance between fiscal responsibility and serving the people of the province, which is what government is all about, then that's where 90% of the people are, as I understand it, in their heads. So you come to the same conclusion, but you got to share the information first. I can't say to you, Sue, listen, I'm sorry, I can't tell you exactly, what I looked at. I can't tell you what information I had. But believe me now, in 6 months or a year, you're going to find out some things, maybe from some other, and you'll say, boy, that Raj made a good decision. I'm glad he did that for me 6 months ago or 8 months ago. That was the approach and the attitude, and it was all wrapped up in Bill 29 about not sharing. Let me tell you one little story. When we were in the government with Clyde Wells, Andy Wells was the outspoken mayor of St. John's, and I'll tell you how it resonated. He made a comment one time about secrecy in the government, because that always comes up, no matter where you are, at what point in time, and no matter how much you share. If you don't get the information you want, you're always going to be accused with too much, of having too much secrecy or not sharing information. So there has to be the balance. But Andy Wells came to the government looking for some information. I don't remember the exact issue. But when he was interviewed outside the Confederation building when he left, because the media were interested in the story, he made a comment. They said, did you find out what you wanted? He said, no. And here's the phrase he used. He said, it's easier to get information from the Kremlin in Russia than it is from the crowd of liberals in that Confederation building, because we were in there at the time as the government. And I'll tell you how that resonated. I was knocking on doors in my district in central Newfoundland just after that, and people were saying, why are you people hiding stuff from the mayor of St. John's? Why is it that why won't you tell the mayor what he wants to know? So, people make that kind of a connection, and we were wearing that somewhere else. Well, this government, and Premier Dunderdale and her group in particular, wore that, and it will be to their detriment. You can try to sugarcoat it now and say, oh, well, we understand people think there's something wrong with it, so we're going to initiate a review. That means they're not going to do anything about it. That means they're going to kick it out to somebody and try to bury it for a while. But meanwhile, the legislation will function just as it does from now to then. Nalcor will still be exempt from anything from now to then. So Mr. Marshall needs to take the next big step, which is to say, we're going to tell you, we're going to have the oversight. We're going to tell you what's going on over at Nalcor. We're going to tell you where they're spending our money. Because, by the way, we're giving them a bunch of money, too, to pay for our 4 and 5 and 10% shares in the offshore. But we're not allowed to find out how much they got spent, how much is spent to date. We're going to spend it. Sure, why not tell us where it's gone? So, Bill 29 and the Telegram did a really good article on getting to understand it, inviting people to delve more into it, because it's the information, the freedom of information to act is not about hiding things. It's supposed to be about on what basis, what's the reasonable and best and most appropriate way for government to give you the information, as the article pointed out, that you as a taxpayer have already paid for. Like, you paid for the studies that were done. You paid for the information that was given to the politicians. So why don't they treat us all as adults to the greatest extent possible and share the information with us and then try to lead us all to common conclusions and decisions instead of saying, no. Later on, you'll find out some things and then you'll understand why we did this and then you'll understand why it's good for you. Well, I think most people would believe, you tell me what's happening and I'll figure out whether it's good for me or not. I don't need you to tell me.
Yeah, it's an interesting spin they took on it from, only a decade ago, needing to have everything out in the open. They certainly became very, very secretive. On your colleague now, you're the newly, newly elected leader of the Liberal Party here in Newfoundland and Labrador, Dwight Ball. What do you think of his leadership? What do you think of the attraction from both parties, where we've had, two Conservatives, two PCs, Tom Osborne, Paul Lane, and now Dale Kirby and Mr. Mitchell Moore have now gone over with the Liberals. What do you think of the new leader? What do you think of his style? And what do you think of his chances?
Couple of things. I think it was very important, not only for Dwight Ball but for the Liberal Party itself as well, to have had a contested leadership, because that, Sue, was the first time since the leadership that myself and John Efford and Paul Dix were involved in back in 2000. So it's been 13 years since the Liberal Party had a contested leadership. From then on, it was just a matter of a caucus meeting or the board of the party meeting and saying, here, you take this job for a while, or you take it now, and you take it now, and then who would take it? So it was just, passing the baton amongst a small group of people to see who would be declared to be the leader. But no Liberals, none of the general public or anybody else had a say in it. The beauty of what the Liberals did in the race that Dwight Ball won was that they opened it up to Liberal supporters. You didn't have to be a member of the party. And I think the numbers were somewhere close to 40,000 people signed up and said, I want to have a say in who that leader is. And they had a say, and Dwight Ball won. The other messaging in it, even from that point in time, was this. It was a very good race. And in my view, and I said this publicly at the time, it was a race that attracted a lot of interest, not because there were just a few well-known Liberals in it, Dwight Ball, Danny Dumresk, Jim Bennett, who's a member of the House. Danny used to be a member of the House when I was there, and then Paul Antle at the end of it, who's a known Liberal. But then Kathy Bennett came forward and faced down the accusations, actually, that she was, I think some people used a conspiracy theory and said she was like a Danny Williams plant, and she was really a conservative. She donated to the Conservative Party and all those things, and she was on the Nalcor board, and she supports Muskrat Falls when the Liberal caucus and the Liberal opposition didn't. But she generated an unbelievable amount of interest in the race. And now it's good to see that she's continuing on, announcing that she's following through on what she said. She's going to run in the district that I live in, by the way, Virginia Waters, where Kathy Donnerdale is currently the member, in the next general election. And she's going to run for the Liberals. So right away there were messages that people like her and others, not just Dwight Ball, but there was Paul Antle, for example, very successful businessman in his own right, looking at the Liberal Party as the right vehicle, the right philosophy, the right time to potentially become the leaders in the province again. People in the province, by the way, by and large, don't have extreme political views. They're a lot more middle of the road. It's much like Canada. Canada is a small L liberal country. We don't seem to have as much of the big divide as you'd see in American politics, where there are some very radical right-wingers, some very radical left-wingers, and some people bunched in the middle of the road. Canada seems to be the middle of the road with not very much extreme, to the point that Danny Williams, for example, for the time that he was the Conservative Premier, for his 7 years, he used to describe himself, guess what the phrase he was? He used to describe himself as a red Tory. He didn't want to be a blue Tory. That means, you're cutting and slashing and just taking care of the money and shag the people. He said, no, I'm a red Tory. Red, by the way, is liberal. Red and liberal are synonymous. That's why they use the phrase. Bill Barry made his announcement a few days ago, a businessman again, saying that he's basically a red Tory. He cares for people. He wants to make sure that those weakest amongst us are taken care of, and you have to have a good health care system, and you have to do it. Now you got to watch out for the bottom line too. But right away they run for the Conservatives, but they say, but it's not all about the bottom line. It's not all just about money. It's about people. So that's where the Liberal Party is, and that's where now you have people. In the first instance, Tom Osborne, for example, went through a pretty legitimate process, as I see it. He was the longest-serving member of the Conservative caucus, stepped aside as an independent, checked with his constituents, looked at the options and said, no, I choose the Liberal Party with Dwight Ball as the leader then, as the vehicle by which I can best represent my constituents and hopefully contribute to a leadership role in the province. Paul Lane didn't go through that lengthy a process in terms of sitting as an independent, but here was a rabid Conservative supporter one day turning around, looking at the options, saying, I don't like where this group is going. I see the future, and in looking at the options, I can sit as an independent and see what that brings, or I can go with the Liberal Party because I believe they have a good leader in Dwight Ball, that they stand for the right things, and, they'll provide good leadership into the future. And then, of course, even just today, you had a couple of new Democratic members who had sat as independents for a considerable period of time, weighed their options and said, no, we believe we can better serve our constituents in a Liberal caucus. And all of them have been saying they believe that Dwight Ball brings the kind of integrity that you'd like to see in a leader. That he's not an opportunist. He's not going to make those wild pronouncements and those daring statements, but he's a good, professional, solid, competent leader, a successful businessman in his own right, and a person that you can really depend on and count on, and that he will be a good leader. So, the strangest thing that happened still in this province was the implosion, I guess, of the New Democratic Party. Only 3 years ago were touted as being possibly the official opposition. And on the way up, and here they are now, people saying that after the review of their leadership in May, they might go into oblivion again. So, times change very quickly in politics, and they're all good signs. The leadership itself, the race itself, was important and necessary and critical for the Liberals. This race will be necessary, important, and critical for the Conservatives. The review that the NDP are going to go through will be necessary and critical and important for them. So it's going to be an exciting next 8 or 10 months or so in politics in this province.
On the Conservative leadership now, the PC leadership, and you mentioned earlier that, of course, the Liberals hadn't had a real contested race since 2000. The Conservatives go back before that to 1995, and they're choosing a delegate route. Now, from where I sit, and just looking at it, maybe I'm just a bit cynical, I don't know, probably, but I see it as you have a delegate convention and you have so many people guaranteed to come in a room and vote. You continue to not have full and open participation of people, let's say, who cannot afford to come to a convention to do this and do that, and maybe don't have the time or just won't be able to be involved in that way. At this time of changing politics in our country, what do you think of their choice of going the delegate route?
It probably shows the same difficulty that they had in trying to blame Kathy Dunderdale's departure on the emergence of social media and so on. They're almost trying to pretend that these things that are here and maturing and continuing to grow and will be a constant part of the future, they're almost trying to suggest that no, we can ignore that and sort of like go back to the good old days of the delegated convention. I think that it's already been proven by the New Democrats and the Liberals in several provinces, nationally and here provincially, that's archaic. It's a thing of the past. Why would you have 12 or 1,500 people who are basically party faithful make this determination when you could do as the Liberal Party just did in Newfoundland and Labrador and involve 30 or 40,000 people directly in the vote? You could still do a show of some description in a room, which the Liberals did, and you can make it as big or as small as you want. But they seem to be desperate enough to think, in my view at this point, that if they get a big media hype thing for a couple of days at one of the hotels in St. John's, that's going to change the people's opinion of them in the polls. And I think that the opinion is already formed. I used to tell my friends that several months ago, my view last fall was that Kathy Dunderdale had become sort of redundant as the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador. People weren't taking her seriously anymore. They tuned her out. She spoke, she was the Premier, but they weren't really listening to her. They weren't paying much attention to her anymore. People are not paying much attention to this government anymore, and they think that by having a couple of thousand people and a big hoopla, a lot of banners and a lot of noise and stuff for a day or so, it's going to change the impression. I think they're missing a real opportunity to engage with the people. I think they should have gone the route of finding better and creative ways of using social media, reaching out to the general public at large, even when they get criticism from people like myself who are known to be of another stripe. Well, dig into that. Find out why is it that I think something they're doing is so wrong, and then can they find some argument to convince me that I'm wrong, or are they just going to keep on going? And you know, one of the interviews that was done after Kathy Dunderdale's departure was a couple of cabinet ministers in terms of Susan Sullivan and Kevin O'Brien trying to give some reasons. And I think there have been articles written in the paper about it since. They acknowledged no fault amongst themselves, no fault with her. It was all a problem. The media picked on them. Social media was bad. You know, tweets were getting out all the time. People were finding out stuff that they didn't want them to find out. It was all happening like too fast for them. Well, that's the world we live in, by the way. That's how it happens these days, and there's going to be more and more and more of that. Today I was speaking with a person who's involved with one of the seniors complexes, and what they're doing is they're now raising money to bring more and more computers and laptops and iPads and so on into the seniors' home for the use of the seniors, because they had made an assumption before that, well, these people are like in their 80s and 70s and 90s, and they don't want to be like Googling things. Well, guess what? They're finding out that 20 and 30% of the residents today want that, and as these people come in the future, who are now only in their 60s and 70s, they're going to be used to it. So they're trying to get ahead of the curve now and prepare these seniors' homes to be ready for people to engage with social media, with the internet, and those kinds of things. And that's, I think, where the PC party is missing a big opportunity to reach out to the general public of Newfoundland, and instead going back to closed shop, old style stuff. And maybe it stems from, you can probably control that a bit better if you're trying to put somebody in the job as the leader, because you can control the delegates, control how many, you can probably control a bit better the old system than you can if you open it up to 40 or 50,000 people. But I think the way of the world today is open it up, let the chips fall where they may. The best person will come out on top if they convince the majority of this broad-based group of people that they are the best person, and that's where it should be.
Yeah, it's really kind of strange, actually, because when we look at it, of course, with our type of democracy, we don't elect a leader, we elect a party, and of course, people have always wanted more play in that and more of a role in that. And then when Kathy Dunderdale resigned, which, by the way, I have to insert here that I've taken great offense to people like Minister Sullivan and Minister O'Brien, who are trying to tell the people it's their fault. We mistreated the Premier through social media, as well as the media giving her an unfair shake. They're blaming it all on the people, and you pointed out earlier there's only one way for her to leave, and that's they got rid of her, because we can't do anything with her until the general election. But in the face of all that, then the new Premier, Tom Marshall, comes out and says, we want to listen to the people. We now want to listen to the people. We realize we probably weren't listening. Now we want to listen to the people. And in the face of that, they're going back to a delegated convention. Do you see a bit of hypocrisy there?
Well, there's certainly two diametrically opposed messages, put it that way. And Tom Marshall, look, to his credit, he's saying the right things. But obviously there's not much of a stomach for it within the inner workings of the PC party if they if they turn around and say we want to have a delegate convention instead of an opportunity to listen to 30 or 40 or 50,000 people and engage them in the process. So they want to listen to people, as Mr. Marshall says. That's what they say. Whether we can believe them or not, we'll find out. And, they're going to do a review of Bill 29 because they finally have understood that almost every single person in the province thinks it's wrong. Well, when did the light finally strike the 30 or so of them that are in that caucus when it struck 500,000 other Newfoundlanders the day after it was pronounced and announced? So, they're a bit late coming to their senses. So in the meantime, to miss an opportunity, they seem to be working at sort of opposing ends of the line here, pulling and tugging in different directions. But Tom Marshall is doing exactly what Kathy Dunderdale did, because if you reflect back, Sue, I think the people of Newfoundland and Labrador would have suggested and would agree that in the couple of months that Kathy Dunderdale was the interim premier, which Tom Marshall is now, that she did a couple of things that were pretty decent. She seemed to be caring. She seemed to be reaching out. She settled this very difficult strike thing. She seemed to be wanting to make a bit of a difference. But then when she became the premier, officially, because nobody else ran all of a sudden, nobody else wanted it. I mean, that was a message in itself to the party, that here was a party that had been in office since 2003. 7 years later, in 2010, it gets to the point that nobody wanted to lead the party. Kathy Dunderdale's first announcement was that, well, don't count it out, but that's not my plan. I don't plan to lead this party. So we had not a single soul wanted to lead a party that was in control of a significant majority government. So right away you had to start scratching your head saying, what is wrong here? And and then compare that to the Liberal Party in opposition 6 months ago, in which 5 people came forward saying, and spending their own money, by the way, in good chunks of it, saying, I want to lead this party. Here was a party in government, apparently with lots of money, and nobody wanted to lead it. And now you've got so far as of today, you've still got people supposedly being rumored to think about it. And I believe that there's a second person, Mr. Oliver, probably going to make his announcement that he will run tomorrow. I expect he's making an announcement that he's going to run. Why else would he make an announcement to say he's not running? You don't have to make an announcement to not do something. So you got Bill Barry, who's not inside the ranks of the government and the party. Charlie Oliver, who's, at least I know him personally, at least he's a known conservative within the party, but he's not within that inner political circle. You don't have any of the caucus members, any of the 30 elected members who have yet said, I am definitely running to be leader of this party and premier of this province. So, it raises the question again, what's the hesitancy? I mean, if Bill Barry can jump out and say, I want to be the premier, why wouldn't one of the cabinet ministers or one of the caucus members jump out and say, yes, sir, we're doing good stuff here. I believe in what we're doing. I want to be the premier. Why wouldn't Susan Sullivan jump out and say, I want to be the leader? Why wouldn't Kevin O'Brien, who was rumored to have wanted the job several years ago, why wouldn't he jump out now and say, yes, I want to lead this party. I want to be the premier of the province. There's a bit of a disconnect here somewhere. So they've got a very fine gentleman, a nice man in Tom Marshall, who's the gatekeeper right now, saying some very nice things and doing a good job saying what he has to say, but he doesn't seem to be resonating with the hierarchy of the Conservative Party, doesn't seem to have any impact. And again, it's obvious he doesn't want the job, because he's been saying for 2 years now, 2 years and a bit since the last election. I mean, he was the first one. He's the first one that I remember that came out a matter of days after just getting elected for a 4-year term under our fixed election legislation, was elected and was appointed to the cabinet. A few days later said, oh, I'm glad to be in the cabinet, but by the way, I'm not running in the next election. I mean, most people keep that for like the 3rd year or halfway into the 4th year, but to say it a matter of days after you're just elected, that, okay, I'm going to sit this 4 years, guys, but I'm not sitting anymore. So, a lack of interest, doesn't want it, Tired? Is he tired? I don't know, but at least he's saying some of the right things right now. But it doesn't seem like the executive of the PC party are on the same page that he's on.
I don't know where this is going. I'm not convinced entirely that he won't run yet. I had to listen to Kathy Dunderdale as interim premier saying, I don't want the job, and all of a sudden it was the job. So I don't know where that's going to go. But certainly if your first message is out there that, listen, we haven't been listening to the people, we hear you now, so what we're going to do is have a delegated convention, it's certainly not resonating somewhere. Something is askew. Moving on to the current budgetary situations, and I'm going to start with the pensions and unfunded pension liabilities. Because I remember, of course, that went on for years and years, and I think it was Brian Tobin that finally, Clyde Wells, I think, had the actuarials done, and then Brian Tobin started to do some refunding of the pensions, which you carried on with after that. Danny Williams came in, and that was a deal you're going to make with Ottawa. We want our chunk of money, and you're going to throw that in the pensions. Now, unfortunately, I think we lost a fair chunk of it in the demise of the market for a while. But we're in quite a bit of a state there now, and we're talking about debt, and we're talking about increasing debt and continuing deficits. What's up with this when we're in the height of the money coming in with the oil? What's your take on it?
Well, I think most people are already coming to the conclusion that we missed a great opportunity in the last 6 or 7 years when we had the highest revenues that the province has ever seen, but we didn't put together a plan to make sure that it was targeted. Now, Danny Williams did do, that thing right in terms of taking the Accord money and putting into the pension funds, and he, like anybody else, had no control over the fact that the markets lost about 40%. That was a global phenomenon that nobody in Newfoundland, Labrador, Canada, the United States, or anywhere in the world really had any control over. It was everybody suffered that, but there was no plan outside of that in terms of taking the money. But instead, what we did is we took money and created Nalcor, which left us with liabilities in terms of money we had to give them to buy our positions in the offshore, because we became, an investor in things instead of a service provider. So it's a huge leap and a huge gap, and that's a debate for another time, Sue, that someone needs to have in terms of the future and whether or not we stay there. Because it's great to invest money, and the investments are good and solid from this point of view. That just like Emera now with Muskrat Falls and just like Nalcor, you're guaranteed a rate of return. And the rate of return is higher than what the markets are. But, you're going to get at least 9%. So why wouldn't you put $1 billion over there if you knew you're going to get 9%? But that's fine if there's no risk. But when you invest in the offshore, there's risk, because if there's a spill or if there's damage or if there's overruns, you're liable for your share of those costs because you're a part owner in terms of the project, instead of just being an owner of the overall resource, which we are anyway. So there was a huge policy decision taken there that the only person I think that was brave enough to stand up to Danny Williams at the time and say he didn't think it was right was Mr. Henley from the Henley Group of Companies. They had a feature on him in a telegram celebrating his 80th or his 85th birthday, and he said, look, I'm a lifelong conservative, but I believe Danny Williams is making a huge mistake in terms of using the money that governments are supposed to use to either pay down debt or provide services, pay down pension fund liabilities, unfunded liabilities, instead of trying to be a big player in the offshore. You don't have to play in the offshore when you own it. Just be the owner, collect the money, no risk. Collect your royalties and go to the bargaining table and maximize your royalties is your job, not to go and invest in it to try to make a few dollars, in an oil play instead of in the stock market. So there was a missed opportunity. We had it laid out because the document that was used to convince Ottawa to give us the Atlantic Accord money, which we had up to 2012, where you could take the oil money and not have to pay it back in equalization. That was laid out in the Royal Commission report done by Vic Young, James Iglitore, and Sister Elizabeth Davis while I was the Premier. And there's a full chapter in there showing how the resources from the offshore were going to peak around 2010, that kind of stuff, 2009, 2000. It all happened. And thankfully, the government of Canada let us keep the money, but we didn't earmark it for certain things. What the government did, and which is what this administration, the current administration, is going to have to wear, is that instead of having a balanced approach and a plan, they grew the total cost of government, the outlay of money. Never mind a lot of money came in. The money going out in terms of the annual budget has increased by well over 50%, closer to 100, almost doubled. You know, in round numbers, the provincial budget when I was the Premier 11 years ago, in 2003, was just under $5 billion. It's now approaching $9 billion, almost doubled in terms of how much money we have to spend every year to keep the province going. And everybody knows inflation didn't go up that much in a few years. So, you know, my own personal view is to take a little sideways swipe at Danny Williams, is that he had a lot of political capital, but he was much more interested in doing things to make sure he was popular than doing the right things to make sure the province was on a good, sustainable track into the future. And this is one area where he and they, and continued on by Mrs. Dunderdale, have missed the boat. They didn't deal with those serious issues when they had the extra money to do so. They did invest in some infrastructure, which is a good thing, but the rest of it now, the money is here, is gone, the peak is over. Now they're talking about going to the markets again this year to borrow, to, you know, just, we got to go to the markets. We're not going to bring in enough money to match how much we're going to spend this year as the government for the first time in just about 10 years. So all those glory years, the golden age, as Tom Marshall said, he hasn't said it since he's been Premier, but what he was saying a little while ago when he was the Finance Minister, the golden age seemed to have come and gone in a bit of a flash, and they missed an opportunity, and they didn't focus on it, and, now it's going to be really tough from here on in. It's going to be back to being governing much in the same kind of mindset as when I was the Premier, that you have to be very, very careful about your expenditures. You have to be very, very specific in setting your priorities for the year. And, it's going to be back to old-style government of a delicate balancing act instead of making speeches about how wonderful the economy is, how great everything is, how we're now have province in Canada and all those. That's all great, but it means nothing in terms of people's households and what they're doing if you don't really keep government finances in some semblance of order.
It's funny, because I'm going to take it to task a little bit now. But first of all, on the have status, that, of course, is a mathematical equation by Ottawa, and as you point out, doesn't reflect in households, and certainly not with, for instance, things like our unemployment rate and suffering in our rural community and our geographic size versus population. What it is a mathematical equation, and someone tells us we're have, when there's a lot of indicators here that clearly we need a lot more infrastructure spending. We have a geography that's mass with a population that's small. We do everything on per capita. That doesn't work for us. But going back to the $2 billion and, giving Danny some credit for that, I've got a couple of issues. I'll just throw them at you. One, he might have taken, when we say, well, nobody knew that this crash was going to happen, obviously, and then it happened, and obviously it impacted us along with others. There's no problem, and he certainly didn't take any responsibility for that, nor should he have in that sort of call. But he took all responsibility for getting all the great revenue gains that we were so blessed with. All of a sudden we had tons of money, and he took full credit for that when all of the deals that were generating it had nothing to do with him being in power. So I take some, I sit back a little bit, and I'm a little more cynical on that because of the credit he took for the revenue side. There's no doubt that there wasn't proper planning made. And on the $2 billion, it was what we were dictated to use it for which was debt of some sort, and he put it on pensions. Had we negotiated a position where we could have used it where we wanted to, that $2 billion would have gone a long way in developing a hydro resource that would not have been affected by markets and would have been a lot safer in that play. But that's my take on that. So, that's I really have a problem when he's not going to take responsibility on the one hand on the spending, but he's going to take all the responsibility for the increase in the revenues. We've just had an Auditor General's report, and if you go back, and I'm sure you remember, so you don't have to see the Hansard, but if people go back and have a look at the Hansard, the Auditor General's report was brought up by Danny Williams in opposition and his party over and over and over and over and over again. I'm not talking about the expense scandal. I'm talking about general Auditor General issues. And they're faced with those same issues now, probably a little worse. And yet again, no real progress seems to have been made there. And there's a lot of significant problems going on that we see with the Auditor General's report. So considering that was such an important issue for them in 2002, 2003, what progress have you really seen with that?
Sue, it's always the Auditor General's report. It's always a significant calendar event during the year that the politicians and the media and people generally, I think, pay a fair bit of attention to. Unfortunately, it's fairly predictable because the Auditor General and the scrutiny they put through, by its very nature, I guess is more detailed and precise than normally happens, and it's done without any consideration for political or personal type of considerations in the issue being discussed. Let me. I didn't say that very well, but let me try to give this example to talk about it. He talked this time around about the issue of people in the healthcare system, particularly Eastern Health, who are retired and then being called back and the callback hours and being paid overtime and getting as much in overtime as they worked. That's very true. So if the only role in government and the only role in delivering health care is to just say your budget is $50 and don't spend any more than $50, done. But I'd give some credence in that example, for example, to Mrs. Kaminsky, who came out and said, listen, with the contracts that we have in place and everything, so unless we're going to renegotiate all these contracts now, which is probably not a bad thing to try to do, but that leads to its own headaches, that if you have a person and they go home and the contract says if you need that person, then you bring them back, the contract says the minimum recall is 3 hours. And if they're only needed for 15 minutes, the other part of the contract says they come back and do whatever procedure you want them to do, and they only need to do once. You don't keep them sitting around doing nothing for the other 2 hours before you let them go home. But if someone else comes into emergency half an hour later and you need that person, you got to call them in again. You got to pay them another 3 hours. You see, in terms of delivery of the system, that payment of the funds makes some sense, but it never would to an auditor who said, well, why wouldn't you hire more people? But if you hire more people, now you've got to try to find them, for example. This was obviously a specialist type of position. You've got to find 2 or 3 of them. Then you've got to pay all the benefits. Then you've got to have holidays for them. So, you'd end up paying $150,000 or $160,000 to 4 people, and none of them would actually still be working that overtime that you didn't just cover. So, you'd still, there are considerations that the Auditor General doesn't have to make. But so that's on the specific nature. But on the large scale, there are always issues whereby they look at departments and they're running and say you're just not following your own rules. And that's where the problem lies. And there seems to be no indication whatsoever that the Conservative government that ranted about that kind of thing in opposition did anything with respect to really heeding the advice of the Auditor General and insisting that their own managers, their own ministers, their own people follow the rules that were laid down in their own departments. So, you take a group, the Conservatives had a former Auditor General. This is the most galling one of all to me. A former Auditor General John Noseworthy, who toyed with running for a couple of different political parties, Liberals and Conservatives, ran as a Conservative in the election, got defeated, and Minister Joan Burke at the time, Joan Shea I think it is now, turned around and gave him a contract for $150,000 to do some kind of study, and we're not allowed, because of, all the way back to Bill 29, we're not allowed because of Bill 29 to ever see the study or see what he did or what he said, but he got paid $150,000. So here's a former Auditor General taking $150,000 from the government after leaving the job. He's retired. He's a pensioner. So is he double dipping? He would argue no, because he didn't go on a salary. He was a consultant out in the field who got paid handsomely for putting his name on the ballot for the Conservative Party in an election. So those kinds of things, they're terrible, they're awful, and there's no sign whatsoever that I can see that the Conservative administration that started in 2003 and is now into its 11th year has given any real credence to the Auditor General as someone that they should listen to and try to follow the kinds of things that he's saying. And I say he because it has been a he since Senator Marshall left that job. That he has been saying in terms of at least try to follow the rules, guys. Try to be serious keepers of the public purse in line with the rules that are there for you today.
Yeah, I mean, this government, I don't know, I guess from the outside looking in, and certainly I've heard a lot of commentary on it, very partisan, lots of political patronage, and we see a fair bit of that. I mean, and even just ignoring the Auditor General's report for a minute, just even the discussion around, I remember, for instance, when you were still Premier, they were in opposition. What were you going to get out of the Voisey's Bay deal? You're going to be appointed to this board, that board, this board. And we see even Nalcor, and they have appointments on the board there, and we sit down and question, what even are the qualifications? And it boils down to these are partisan appointments. Look at I guess it's the Liquor Commission, Newfoundland Labrador Housing, Ross Reed, who is 1 minute a deputy, next minute he's out running the election campaign, then he's rehired, same way with Len Sims. I mean, where are the changes there that they were so radically shouting and roaring about when you were Premier?
I think it comes back to a phrase I used an hour or so. It comes back to the word naive again. When they were in opposition, being led by Danny Williams, a person that I had no experience whatsoever, had lots of experiences elsewhere, but none whatsoever into the backroom workings of a political system, a caucus, a cabinet, those kinds of things. And he found out very quickly that in order to, keep the thing functioning for your group, in your party, in your caucus, I think everybody's always accepted there's always been some level of patronage, but when it becomes overly blatant and just too much of it, you pay the price for it at a point in time. People get sick of it, And, the classic example of Canada is when Trudeau left and did all the Senate appointments going out the door, and John Turner lost an election because of it.
Yeah.
Because people were just sick of the whole concept. They understood a bit of patronage, but you didn't have to rub it in your face. And it seems that once this group got elected, they said, "Oh, it's our turn." Instead of saying, "Well, we sort of railed against that, we preached against that," because matter of fact, I even agreed, and we did, and you can find it in the contract today with the Voisey's Bay deal. I said, "Listen, I don't have any problem with this. I don't want any benefit for me in this. I don't want any benefit for anybody in this legislature in this. I want this to benefit the people of Newfoundland and Labrador." And there's actually a clause in there that's still there today that says no one who participated in the legislature, the 48 people there at the time, was to ever be given any kind of employment or contract or work as a result of the Voisey's Bay deal. And to my understanding, that's the way it is today. I've never even talked to anybody in that particular company since, because it's not my role. Now, opposite for them, they agreed with that at the time, but as you say, but opposite to them, Danny Williams is not at the Premier's chair for a year, and all of a sudden he's sitting on the board of mining companies trying to get power from Muskrat Falls that he announced a couple of months ago. So all of a sudden, like I say, the view changes, and to me, it's wrong. It's absolutely wrong, and there's a huge conflict of interest there that I don't know why more people didn't pick up on it, but they should have, and then they just didn't change. Now they've gotten used to we've been in the government for 10 years. Sure, it's like our little playground. We can reward whom we like and just ignore the rest. Well, what seems to be happening, Sue, is that they have had their little bit of fun. They have had their little playground. They've ignored people at their peril, and it seems to me that it's about to come home to roost. I see a serious changing of the political climate, and I believe no matter what the Conservatives do with their leadership and whatever they do with their delegated convention, I don't think it's going to go any significant ways at all to changing the people's opinion of a government that did run out of ideas and energy and so on in 10 short years. Remember, their theme in the 2010 election was new energy, and Susan Sullivan and Kevin O'Brien were on the panel talking about the departure, saying it's time for us to get some new energy. They just suggested 2.5 years ago that's what they were bringing, and all of a sudden they ran out of it and got to go looking for it all over again. So I think people they're seeing that, they're sensing that, they're feeling that, and many of those people, they can change the face and the talking head now at the front of the bus, but the crowd on the bus hasn't changed much, other than a few defections. And as long as you're still going to have those people saying the same thing and not really buying into any real change, I think it's only a matter of time before the people of the province do get to have a say. And it'll happen, by the way, before next summer, before the summer of 2015 by legislation, because if they wait until July to pick their leader, then that means they have to have an election before the next July. And it's a matter of then when that new leader calls the election, and then the people of the province will have a real say as to whether or not it's time to put a new group in charge, to trust someone else, to give new energy to a new group of people, and let's see if we can't open the thing up. Trust Newfoundlanders to be intelligent, educated, sensible, logical people. Share information with them. Explain why you're making decisions. Explain the circumstance to them. Tell them the truth. Show them what's happening. And like I said, basically treat them as adults. Treat the people as adults and let them participate and make up their own minds instead of trying to convince them that I'm right, I know better, you don't need to know. And by the way, if you do find out, you'll finally figure out I was right anyway.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how they actually drag the election out, because the legislation says that the new leader must be sworn in as premier. And I assume if they don't swear the person in as premier until they do, that clock doesn't start ticking. So let's see if they try to stretch that interpretation. Yet I'm not convinced that we're not going to be extended longer. Just over.
Well, it'll be Sue. It'll be a tough one to have a leader declared at a big delegated convention on live TV to try to generate all this excitement, and then say, "Oh, by the way, we're not going to swear him until October."
Well, they might say, "Well, we want to get him elected
July
first."
October, but
yeah, well, they might say we want to get him elected first, have a by-election in one of their seats, put them in. No, with this crew, I'm going to be cynical and say I won't believe we'll get an early election until we actually get the early election. But I'm not as bad as that. No, I know you're not. It's my cynicism. We've got a little over 6 minutes, and I just want to touch base quickly on the other resource sectors. Let's take forestry and let's take the fishery. Two of those were also hammers that the Tory opposition used over and over and over again. They're going to fix the fishery. They're going to save rural Newfoundland and Labrador with respect to the fishery. The two paper mills, they're not going to go anywhere. We've lost all that. We've lost a number of plants. Really now, can you give me like a 2 or 3 minute answer on how they performed as it relates to those important sectors?
Fundamentally, Sue, two different approaches in the forestry. It seems to me that ever since the expropriation in Grand Falls of the mill, the Abitibi mill in Grand Falls, because with that, never mind the mistake that they weren't going to take the mill and they accidentally did and left us with a big environmental liability and so on, and never mind the fact that we violated the NAFTA agreement and we weren't really allowed to do it, and it cost the federal government, I don't know, was it 150 or 3? I think it was $300 million. But anyway, remember, that's my money and yours too. That's taxpayers' money that we had to pay out. But then they got the energy resource, which we haven't been able to utilize because there's no line coming to the Avalon where it's needed. And then they had the forest resource itself. And they talked about here was going to be an opportunity for all this wood that came back to the government now that used to be in the hands of woodlots that were assigned to Abitibi. All of this massive amount of wood. It was going to be a great opportunity for sawmillers, and we were going to advance the sawmill industry. And remember, you might have heard something about pelletizing. We were going to make pellets, for burning in stoves and so on. Well, it seems like they got frightened to death to do any of it. So they did a group of studies, and you've had sawmillers out there. It was only, I think, just a few months ago, you had one of the biggest sawmillers in Newfoundland who was shutting down because they couldn't get access to wood. And by the way, there's been more, with the expropriation, there's been more wood in more acreage, in more lots available for the provincial government, who now owns it instead of a paper company, to allocate to sawmillers than ever before, but they couldn't provide it. They couldn't get there. It seemed like they stumbled and fell and didn't really know what to do, and they were sort of waiting for some miracle to happen, and there was something going to happen on the Northern Peninsula in Roddington, and we were going to be exporting pellets around the world, and it all seems to have been for naught. In my hometown of Grand Falls, Windsor, where I grew up and still spend a fair bit of time, they always floated the rumor because they wanted something to be sort of on the go that, at least part of this plant was going to be sold to somebody. And it wouldn't be a paper mill again, but it would probably be a large pellet plant, a pellet producing plant. Don't know where that, it seems to surface and disappear. And it seems like they really don't know what they want to do. They don't seem to have any kind of a plan as to how to utilize the resource. Now, in the fishery, they've gone the other way. It seems to me they've bent over backwards to try to satisfy the needs of the private sector players. Ever since they let FPI disappear, ever since that, they've seemed to be trying to find ways to appease the big operators. And even to the latest one, now they got I can understand where Earl McCurdy and the group are coming from in the most recent one, where they want to take actual raw, full codfish for the first time in decades and send it into the American market. But I mean, that's really unheard of in terms of the discussion we were having earlier. And I mentioned just briefly to my wife just a day or so ago, and she follows these things with interest. We don't discuss it a lot, but I said, Mariana said, you understand that it's always been like with fish plants and so on, and same thing with sawmills. You like to get the maximum use, the maximum employment here, use it here. Instead of bringing lumber in from the mainland, why don't we make the lumber here, and sell to Rona and Kent and all this kind of stuff instead of seeing it shipped in. We get the sawmills here, yeah. And the fishery, okay, remember, rather than have raw fish head down to Boston or somewhere and come back here as a fish nugget or a fish cake or something else, why don't we make it here? That's always been the mantra. Why don't we do this? Why don't we do the extra processing here? Well, they've gone completely back to the dark ages and says, we can't do any of that here because we can't compete with China and we can't compete with the others, so we got to ship out raw material, not touched. And even to the point that now the Fisheries Union will say, well, and they're in the awkward position of representing the plant workers and the fishermen themselves. And not only that, they've even got their own trawlers, by the way, that they run. But so they got a funny kind of operation going anyway. But you get to the point where now you got the Fisheries Union saying, for the sake of the guys catching the codfish, why don't we try to let them get a couple extra cents by sending the thing, and don't even bother to take the head off it. I'm not even sure if they got to gut it or not. Let's just take it and maybe not even land it here, like lug it right off to the mainland somewhere and see if they can get a few extra cents a pound. And never mind the fact that the plant is still closed in this community, the plant is still closed in that community. Those workers there are never going to get to touch it like they used to. So it seems like they're buying into the argument on the fishery in particular, that we operate in a global market, and unless we can force people to work for $5 an hour, way below the minimum wage, we'll never be able to compete, so we got to let it go. So it seems like they've given up in terms of
okay, we got 30
the
seconds.
resource.
30 seconds left. I'd be remiss, the most questions that I had from the most amount of people, one question, they want to know, and thank you for doing the program, how are you feeling?
Oh, fine as kind. Actually, I'm on the wait list. Expect to get in this month. I'm actually going in for one of the pre-op procedures Monday of next week. So that's a good sign. That means probably within the next couple of weeks or so, I might even be in, get my bypass surgery done, and get back on the go even more so than I am now. I feel great. Just that if I try to exert myself, I really can't do it too much. So talking is not bad. Running around the block, that's a different matter.
Well, I want to really thank you for doing the program. I think it was great. We had a very open discussion about a lot of touchy issues, and I think it was a fabulous show. And I hope to do it again with you in a few months as you're recovering and back to speed.
Thanks, Sue. We'll do it again sometime. Glad to.
Okay, thanks a million. Bye-bye.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.